A customer is parking perpendicular to the parking lot.
Okay, who were the Nephilim?
Chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, you'll encounter let's say, an odd passage. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. What's going on here? The story is so ambiguous, so obscure, so weird. It has inspired thousands of years of creative interpretation within both Judaism and Christianity. Who were these sons of God? And who were these Nephilim? Enormous giants? Ancient demons? Fallen angels? One Hebrew Bible scholar says the passage is a swarm of extremely rare words and phrases with atypical and ambiguous grammar. So, all the respect in the world to the Hebrew Bible scholars who've needed to translate this passage, the unsung heroes of old within biblical studies. But even this is ambiguous. Technically, the text simply says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days when the sons of God and women were getting it on. So it doesn't explicitly equate the Nephilim with their offspring. But very early on in history, interpreters of this passage do assume that the children of the sons of God, the Nephilim, and the heroes of old are all one and the same. The majority of scholarly commentaries on this passage also assume this. The sons of God, or the B'nai Elohim in Hebrew, refers to a heavenly council of divine beings surrounding the God of Israel, God's entourage. They make a few appearances throughout the Hebrew Bible. We can find parallels to these sons of God in the broader world of Canaanite religion. The chief god in the Canaanite pantheon was El, and the children of El make a few appearances as a divine assembly in texts discovered in the city of Ugarit in modern-day Syria. In these texts, they're called a council of those in heaven, sitting on elevated thrones, but they're lesser divine beings, not quite at the power level of El. Later Phoenician inscriptions from the 8th and 7th centuries BCE also refer to a council of the children of El. As with so much of Israelite religion, the B'nai Elohim of Genesis seem to be rooted in the wider religious landscape of the region. This would make the Nephilim some sort of semi-divine beings. Many scholars equate them with Gilgamesh in ancient Mesopotamian mythology. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is described as the son of a goddess and a human father, and he's described as 2/3 god and 1/3 human. This connection is made stronger by the fact that these Nephilim are also described as heroes of old, warriors of renown, Gilgamesh being a quintessential example of an ancient Near Eastern semi-divine hero. The word Nephilim itself can also shed some light on these beings. This Hebrew word has the same root as the verb to fall. So scholars think we should translate Nephilim as the fallen or the fallen ones. But fallen in what sense? Fallen from heaven, as in they descended from a supernatural realm of existence? Fallen in a moral sense, as in distanced from divine grace? Or fallen simply as dead, or fallen in battle? It's ambiguous, but several of the scholars I read while researching this video assume that the last option is the most likely option, fallen as in killed or destroyed. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, fallen one refers to those fallen in battle, like 2 Samuel 1:19, how the warriors have fallen, or Ezekiel 32:27, and they do not lie with the fallen warriors of long ago. This again makes sense considering that they're described as heroes of old, warriors of renown. But that's about all we can learn from this passage. It's very possible that the passage contains so little because the original intended audience already knew about these beings, and so there was no real need to elaborate further. But luckily, the Nephilim do occur one other time in the Hebrew Bible that sheds some light on how these beings were conceptualized by their earliest audience. They appear in Numbers chapter 13. So the backstory here is that the Israelites have escaped from slavery in Egypt, received God's law through Moses on Mount Sinai, and then started to spy out the land promised to their ancestors as they prepared to conquer it. Out of a group of 12 spies, one from each tribe, only 2 bring back a hopeful report, but the rest of the spies saw something scary. All the people that we saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim. The Anakites come from the Nephilim. And to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Here the Nephilim are linked with humans of unusually large size, and of a known ancestry. the sons of Anak. This race of men is so enormous, so strong, that any attempt by the Hebrews to conquer the land would result in being squished like a bug. Again, the passage is ambiguous. On one hand, we could interpret the
Anak?
spy's report as
Yeah,
performative
we'll get into it.
exaggeration, hyperbole to
Like
cover up their
Anunnaki?
military cowardice,
Now
or it
you
could be
get it.
taken as a
Yep.
legit claim that an
Is this
ancient
guy a
lineage
Jew?
of
He looks
giants
like a Jew.
lived in southern Canaan. How they would have survived the flood is
He looks
anyone's
like my
guess.
brother-in-law.
The
He's
authors of the
Jewish.
Hebrew Bible don't care to elaborate. But what we can gather is that the Nephilim were thought to be very large humans, or very large human-like semi-divine beings whose lineage survives in this people called the sons of Anak. Hints that the ancient Israelites believed in a race of giants indigenous to the land of Canaan are sprinkled throughout the Hebrew Bible, but they're not always called the Nephilim. Amos chapter 2 describes the God of Israel destroying the Amorites, whose height is like the height of cedars, and whose strength is like oaks. Many scholars believe that the text is not mere hyperbole, but a claim about the existence of giants. Deuteronomy chapter 2 mentions a few tribes of unusually large people called the Rephaim. The text says, like the Anakim, they are usually reckoned as Rephaim, though the Moabites call them Emim. Deuteronomy chapter 3 also mentions a King Og of Bashan, a guy with a really big bed. Now, only King Og of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Some scholars have proposed that this belief emerged from the Israelites observing the ruins of giant architecture in the landscape. Thousands of huge Bronze Age burial chambers called dolmens can be found across the region. Also, Bronze Age Canaanite cities were monumental, built out of huge stones. Just as an example, the scholar Ron Hendel compares a humble Israelite house to the huge Middle Bronze Age fortifications of the ancient city of Hebron. Currently, they're 18 feet tall, and they were definitely taller thousands of years ago. As the argument goes, some Israelites must have looked back at these fortifications that predated them by hundreds of years and thought, well, a long-lost race of giants must have built these. Maybe it's not a coincidence that so many references to giants also refer to their fortified cities. Deuteronomy chapter 1 says it's a people greater and taller than us, and great cities fortified up to heaven. Dr. Hendel argues that the term Nephilim resonates with this idea that Israelites were looking at abandoned Canaanite ruins. Nephilim, the fallen ones, a civilization now lost. And speaking of giants, when the Hebrew scriptures were first collectively translated into Greek in what's called the Septuagint Bible, in both of these passages, the word Nephilim was translated as gigantes, the giants. These ancient Jewish translators were now living in a Hellenized world. They spoke Greek, they participated in Greek culture, and they must have known and read Greek literature. To them, the Nephilim apparently reminded them of the giants of Greek mythology. Going back to the ancient Greek work of Hesiod called the Theogony, the giants were understood to be pre-Olympian divine beings, born from Gaia, or Mother Earth, sprung from the blood of Father Heaven, or Uranus, after he was castrated. Ouch. According to various sources, these
It's like the
giants
Titans.
battled with the Olympian gods, but were destroyed.
Yeah.
Some sources equate them with the Titans, who also battled the gods only to lose and be imprisoned in the underworld. Other Greek and Roman authors describe the
That's
giants as being
interesting.
punished by the gods and trapped under mountains,
Yeah.
where they're responsible for seismic activity and volcanoes.
Wait, that would
And
be
Greek
the
historians like
fallen
Herodotus
angels
and
would be
Plutarch
trapped in the
even claimed
underworld.
that the
Now you get it. So, the church fathers were very smart people, man. If it was merely a myth, they would have just called it out for being a myth. That's what I'm trying to get at.
bones of giants
Like, I mean, this guy did a very, very free treatment of. I actually like this channel because he does have his own bias, but you know he is coming from a quote unquote historical critical perspective on things. So he lays out to you like he gives you the naturalistic interpretation first, and then he goes into what we can isolate as the possible readings, and then what we can just attribute to a naturalistic explanation based on comparative religious studies. You see what I mean? From the anthropological
Yeah.
records that we have, but then there's specific references between, you know, the Anakim, and then it also refers to another tribe. You see what I mean? That's
Yeah.
unaccounted for by archaeology. Anyways, we'll continue.
had been discovered, leading some modern scholars to argue that these ancient testimonies reflect plausible knowledge of fossils. Now, translation is a tough business. As one scholar says, translators need to find the most appropriate term that evokes a similar set of associations without the need of any additional explanation. So when these Hellenistic Jewish translators encountered the Hebrew word Nephilim, the Greek word giants apparently shared enough traits to result in a good enough translation, a race of big, hybrid divine beings that had been destroyed in centuries past. And throughout the Second Temple period of Jewish history, Jewish authors started to expand the lore surrounding the Nephilim. One of the most notable examples, and probably the earliest example,
Book of
is
Enoch.
First Enoch, a compendium of Jewish apocalyptic literature composed between the 4th century and 1st century BCE, all packaged together into one book. First Enoch begins with a retelling of Genesis known as the Book of the Watchers. Here the Watchers are fallen, rebellious angels who are equated with the sons of God mentioned in Genesis chapter 6. Like in Genesis, they marry human women who give birth to violent, all-consuming offspring called the Nephilim. But while Genesis barely elaborates, First Enoch goes into great detail, saying the women bore great giants, whose heights were 300 cubits, which is around 450 feet or 137 meters. So we're talking Godzilla-sized giants here. Birth is hard enough, so dear God, those poor women. These giant Nephilim have a big appetite. After they consume all of the produce of the land, they turn to eating people. So the giants turned against the people in order to eat them. Eventually, the archangels need to intervene and destroy the giants. Similar stories can be found in the Book of Jubilees and the Book of the Giants, both of which have survived among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Book of the Giants follows a similar story to the Book of the Watchers, with the giants being a source of evil who are eventually destroyed. Interestingly, one of the giants is named Gilgamesh, so again we see a nod to ancient Near Eastern mythology. But outside of Jewish apocalyptic literature like First Enoch or the Book of the Giants, a very different stream of interpretation about the Nephilim also began to develop, arguing that they are not otherworldly hybrid beings, but this-worldly beings. In other words, humans. In the centuries following the destruction of the Second Temple, Jewish rabbis wrote a bunch of interpretations on the Book of Genesis. And in these works, the sons of God were pictured as young aristocrats who married the daughters of commoners. For example, the rabbinic text called Genesis Rabbah assumes that the sons of God, the fathers of the Nephilim, are humans. But as the scholar Annette Reed says, the real question then becomes, why are they called sons of God? The text says Rabbi Simeon ben Yohai called them the sons of nobles, and cursed all who called them the sons of God, while 2 other rabbis floated the idea that they're called sons of God because they had long lives without trouble or suffering. Now, many of these rabbis did assume that the sons of God and the Nephilim were very big people. Some might even say giants. Some rabbis even emphasized that primordial humans in general, starting with Adam, were giants, and that human stature declined over the generations. But the rabbis of this era
That makes
continually
no sense.
reinforced the understanding that
Where,
they were
like,
not subordinate gods, demigods, or the offspring of angels.
what
Even
wouldn't
the
it make
etymology of
sense?
Nephilim as the fallen ones did not evoke fallen angels, but simply
Sorry, what's that?
What absolutely did not make sense was like older humans like breeding with younger humans, like the superior humans breeding with inferior humans, making a even better human. You know what I'm saying? That interpretation makes no sense. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Like, yeah, right. So let's go back. It's this part, right? Where they offered, right? What if Nephilim refers to like the people
Yeah,
like that are like of
because
like a noble class marrying a commoner, but then why are they called
right.
sons of God?
are humans. But as the
Also,
scholar
why
Annette
would it
Reed
be the
says, the
heroes of
real question then
renown?
becomes,
Why are they called sons of God?
why are they called
But
sons of
also
God?
the heroes of renown, like heroes of renown would like indicate like a superior
Like
genetics,
Hercules.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
and it
or
wouldn't because wouldn't if that was the case, like if the sons of gods were humans and then the heroes of renown, that would be a better human, and but that makes no sense. That would be like that big of like a difference,
like
and
in
like
Greek mythology,
in,
right? Zeus kills off Kronos, the Titans, right? And then Zeus morphs into a human and he has sex with human women and he has demigods, right? Like Hercules, like Perseus, You get what I'm saying?
Right. Oh my
The
goodness,
text says,
flipping Gilgamesh. These are actually real names, probably of beings of the
hurled
Nephilim.
the world down, themselves fell from the world of angels. Even the etymology of Nephilim as the fallen ones did not evoke fallen angels, but simply referred to their destroyed lineage or their fallen morality. Genesis Rabbah says Nephilim denotes that they hurled the world down, themselves fell from the world, and filled the world with abortions through their immorality. The fallen angels
But the
interpretation that
heroes
was
of
so
renown.
popular in the Book of Enoch seems to have been
Yeah.
Yeah, that part right there, like both the sons of God and the heroes of renown, indicate something better than humans. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
suppressed during these early centuries of Rabbinic Judaism. Christian interpretations were also mixed. Christian theologians occasionally accepted certain elements of the Nephilim's angelic origin story, while often clearly trying to distance themselves from it too. Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, concedes that the Nephilim were the offspring of angels and women, while Ephraim the Syrian considered them to be real-world descendants of Cain. After all, the Book of Genesis calls them mighty men. St. Augustine interprets the Nephilim as real-world giants who descended from Seth, but eventually became examples of moral failure. Although the angelic interpretation that was so popular in the Book of Enoch subsided in later forms of Judaism and Christianity, it never fully disappeared. The Kabbalistic text called the Zohar, for example, continued to read the Nephilim as fallen angels and situated them within elaborate cosmologies. So it's clear that the concept of the Nephilim evolved over the centuries, beginning as the mysterious children of lesser gods in the Hebrew Bible, to the children of angels in the Book of Enoch, to the progeny of aristocratic humans in early rabbinic texts. While researching this video, the thing that fascinated me the most is the theory that ancient fossils and Bronze Age structures may have inspired beliefs in
King
an
Kunta.
ancient race of
I didn't.
giants.
That's not me.
When we focus
That's you
so much
too.
on ancient texts like the Book of Genesis, we sometimes forget about the archaeology and how ancient beliefs and practices were often shaped by the landscape, both natural and human-made. If you're interested in archaeology, I'm excited to recommend a brand new series called Archaeology Quest. It's a
So interesting, right? He covers it. Like, yeah, sure. This literal interpretation of the Nephilim being the sons of of the fallen angels and the daughters of men, the sons of God and daughters of men. It's kind of gone away, but then you have like the Kabbalistic tradition of Zohar that does keep the claim that they are like a separate breed of humans.
Right.
That's crazy.
So let me see here.
Welcome to Religion for In the Book of Genesis, God instructs Noah how to build a rectangular ark, which artists over the years have envisioned in various ways. Sometimes Noah's Ark looks like an imposing ship, like this 19th century painting. Sometimes a funny-looking box on stilts, like this mosaic from a late Roman synagogue in southeastern Turkey. Or this whimsical cartoon on the cover of Super 3D Noah's Ark for the Super Nintendo. But there are ancient Mesopotamian flood stories predating Genesis that describe an ark that looks very different. Back in 2014, the Assyriologist Irving Finkel translated a flood story found on this, the Ark Tablet, an ancient Babylonian tablet dating somewhere between 1900 and 1700 BCE. It describes a familiar sounding story, a story about an ancient flood and a man who built a huge boat to survive it. Yeah, you don't need a PhD in Assyriology to realize that this sounds a lot like the story of Noah's Ark. This story, however, was composed in Akkadian, not Hebrew. It featured a hero named Atrahasis, not Noah. And his boat? Well, it was circular, not rectangular. Dr. Finkel theorized that a real-world watercraft inspired this early version of the Ark, a circular boat called a coracle. Basically, it's a big floating basket made out of twisted reeds that ancient Mesopotamian people used to float up and down the marshy waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Scholars have long known that the flood story in Genesis draws from earlier stories like the Atrahasis epic. But beyond the shape of the ark, what are the key differences between these stories? What did the ancient biblical narrative change? In the case of Noah's flood, seeing which elements the biblical authors kept, changed, and discarded can give us a new perspective on this familiar story and its cultural context. We're going to examine 4 versions of the Mesopotamian flood myth. In rough chronological order, the Sumerian flood story, the Atrahasis epic that we just mentioned, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and of course, the story of Noah in the Book of Genesis. There are a few other versions that we could mention. There's a 3rd century Babylonian priest named Berosus who wrote a Greek version of the flood story that survives in snippets. There's also a very fragmentary Syrian version of the myth that was found in the ancient city of Ugarit. But if that seems like a lot to keep track of, don't worry, today we're just going to focus on Genesis and the stories that predate it. The oldest known version of the Mesopotamian flood story is the so-called Sumerian flood story, which dates to the 2nd millennium BCE. It's extremely fragmentary, preserved on this clay tablet on display at the Penn Museum of Archaeology in Philadelphia. A relatively recent literary study has traced the story's origins back to around 1900 BCE, though
Hold
the
on a
tablet
second.
itself dates to around 1600. The hero
Alright, I did not hear anything between fragment and 1600.
Okay.
version of the Mesopotamian flood story is the so-called Sumerian flood story, which dates to the 2nd millennium BCE. It's extremely fragmentary, preserved on this clay tablet on display at the Penn Museum of Archaeology in Philadelphia. A relatively recent literary study has traced the story's origins back to around 1900 BCE, though the tablet itself dates to around 1600. The hero of the story is named Ziusudra, which means something like he of long life. According to the story, Ziusudra was king of the Sumerian city of Shuruppak and a priest of the god Enki, who, as we'll see, plays a major salvific role in these stories. Only the lower third portion of the tablet survives, so there are a lot of missing plot points, but the story begins with the creation of humans and the founding of the first cities. After this, there's a big missing chunk in the story, but apparently the gods, led by the god Enlil, conspire to wipe out humanity with a flood. However, the god Enki goes and warns Ziusudra. A decision that the seed of mankind is to be destroyed has been made. The verdict, the word of the divine assembly, cannot be revoked. Then there's another missing chunk, but presumably Enki tells Ziusudra how to make an ark to survive the flood, because the story picks up again with a flood thrashing a big boat around. After the flood had swept over the land for 7 days and 7 nights, and the destructive wind had rocked the huge boat in the high water, the sun god came out, illuminating heaven and earth. Ziusudra made an opening in the huge boat, and the sun god with his rays entered the huge boat. The story ends with Ziusudra disembarking with a bunch of other animals that he rescued, and Enlil granting him immortality, apparently having a change of heart after he had just tried to destroy humanity. Next is the Atrahasis epic that I mentioned in the intro. It survives in several versions in the Akkadian language, including that Ark tablet, but the most famous copy of the epic is found in a 3-tablet cycle from southern Mesopotamia, dating to the 1600s BCE. The story is named after its hero, Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise. Like Ziusudra, he's portrayed as a servant of the god Enki. The Atrahasis epic also begins with the creation of humanity and the plot to destroy them with a flood, again featuring Enlil as the villain and Enki as the savior. According to the story, eventually humanity multiplies and becomes so noisy that they disturb Enlil's sleep. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. So to get a little extra shut-eye, Enlil decides to wipe them all out, which sounds to me like overkill. First he tries a plague, and then he tries withholding rain to kill humanity with a famine, but Enki thwarts him both times. Enlil then decides to send a flood, so Enki goes and warns Atrahasis in a dream, and instructs him to build a big boat and load it with all the animals. According to one version, this dream came to Atrahasis after he spent the night in the god's temple. Atrahasis, pay heed to my advice, that you may live forever. Destroy your house, build a boat, spurn property, and save life. As in the Sumerian version, the flood in the Atrahasis epic lasts for 7 days and 7 nights. The story ends with Atrahasis making a sacrifice for the gods. The third tradition is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The most complete version of this flood story is quite a bit later than the versions we just looked at, inscribed on the so-called flood tablet of the Gilgamesh epic. Dating to around the 600s BCE, this tablet was composed around 1,000 years after the Atrahasis tablets, though other fragments of the Gilgamesh epic have been found that date back earlier to around 1200 BCE. So even though this artifact dates to the 600s BCE, the story is much, much older. While the Epic of Gilgamesh is mostly about the demigod king Gilgamesh, the 11th tablet of this multi-part narrative contains a flood story told by the hero Utnapishtim. His name means he found life, which is more or less an Akkadian translation of the Sumerian name Ziusudra. And like Ziusudra, Utnapishtim is the king of Shuruppak and is portrayed as a servant of the god Ea, the Babylonian version of Enki. In the Gilgamesh epic, no reason is given for the flood at first, but we find out at the end of the story that Enlil decided to send a flood as a culling to diminish the number of people on Earth, though not necessarily to destroy them entirely. As in the other versions, Ea warns the hero to build an ark. In this scene, we see an almost word-for-word copy and paste from the Atrahasis epic. O man of Shurupak, demolish the house, build a boat, abandon riches, and seek survival, spurn property, and save life. Put on board the boat the seed of all living creatures. The near verbatim borrowing shows that the Epic of Gilgamesh was based on Atrahasis. In fact, the Gilgamesh flood story even contains the name Atrahasis in one place where the author didn't change it. The flood subsides on the 7th day, and the story ends with the ark settling on Mount Nisir, Utnapishtim sending out a few birds to search for dry land, and him offering a sacrifice. All of which sounds very familiar if you know your Bible. Proceeding in chronological order, we finally arrive at Noah in the Book of Genesis, which shares some striking parallels with the Epic of Gilgamesh, both in the broad plot points and in the finer details. This version of the flood myth, as it's found in Genesis, dates to around the 5th century BCE, though the Genesis flood story is generally understood to be a mix of at least two earlier sources melded into one, what biblical scholars often call the J source and the P source, or the Yahwist and priestly versions respectively. The J source is usually considered to be older. In Genesis, both the J and P sources begin with the creation of humans and animals, but J adheres more closely to Mesopotamian traditions, with God crafting the first man out of clay, and like the Sumerian story, the J narrative also includes the establishment of the first cities. And then God decides to destroy humanity with the flood. According to the J source, it is the wickedness of humans that motivates the flood. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humans was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. But the man Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, and is instructed to build an ark to survive the flood. Unlike the other versions in which the flood lasts only a week, the flood in Genesis lasts 40 days and 40 nights. Though similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story ends with the ark settling on some mountains, Noah sending out a few birds to search for dry land, and offering a sacrifice. So here we have 4 stories with the same basic plot. A hero who survives a flood by building a boat. Though there's a whole tangle of striking similarities and differences. There are 4 different heroes. 3 of the stories feature the same villain and savior, Enlil and Enki respectively, with one featuring a singular god. All 4 of them involve saving animals from the flood. 2 of them, Gilgamesh and Genesis, feature the hero releasing birds to look for dry land. Clearly, the Mesopotamian flood story was a wide-ranging tradition that was shared and reworked again and again by ancient Near Eastern cultures over the centuries. So let's dig a little deeper into those similarities and differences, starting with the feat of architectural engineering found in all 4 stories: the Ark. Our copy of the Sumerian flood story, unfortunately, is missing the portion about building the ark, so we don't know how it appeared in this story. It simply uses the Sumerian word translated as huge boat. However, the tablets do include an interesting detail after the rain stops. Ziusudra makes a window to let the light in. Ziusudra then drilled an opening in the big boat, and the gallant Utu, the sun god, sent his light into the interior of the big boat. A window scene also appears in Gilgamesh, the Ugaritic flood story, and Genesis. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it says, "I opened a window and light fell on my cheeks." In the Ugaritic
Dude,
flood
that's
story,
actually
take a
crazy
wooden
that all
spade
4
and a
stories
copper
have that
axe
little
and make a
detail.
window at the top. Release a
Yeah.
bird, let it find for you a shore. And Genesis chapter 8 says, "At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made, and he sent out a raven." So the details are a bit different, but apparently a window scene was a shared plot point in each version. We only get specific details about the design and construction of the ark in Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and Genesis. As we've seen in the Atrahasis epic, the god Enki gives Atrahasis specific instructions on how to build a circular ark. Draw out the boat that you will make on a circular plan. Let her length and breadth be equal. The Ark of Atrahasis is made with coiled reeds, it has multiple decks with compartments and a roof, and it was coated with a tar-like petroleum product called bitumen that occurs naturally in Mesopotamia and has been used since antiquity for waterproofing boats. Like I said earlier, this is essentially a huge coracle, a type of round boat that throughout human history was exceptionally popular among societies living around rivers. Coracles were still used in the Mesopotamian regions of Iraq until modern times. What you're looking at are historical photographs of coracle-type boats called kufa in southern Iraq. Neo-Assyrian artwork depicts boats like these paddled by multiple men, and the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, also mentions seeing them in Babylonia. He says they have boats plying the river down to Babylon, which are completely round and are made
Yeah,
of
but what
leather.
about the window?
Although these sources are much, much later than the Atrahasis epic, it's likely that Mesopotamian people were using coracles for thousands of years. Dr. Finkel theorizes that this type of boat inspired the Ark in Atrahasis and would have made a lot of sense to the original audience. They were exceptionally buoyant boats, often created with coiled rope or reeds and covered in bitumen. And though they were potentially difficult to steer, this wouldn't matter so much if all you're trying to do is ride out a storm by bobbing around. And though the Ark in Atrahasis is fantastically huge, these coracle boats were sometimes pretty big, ranging from tiny one-seaters to larger ones that could hold multiple people or even livestock. So the idea of carrying multiple people and animals on board would not have been a particularly outlandish idea to the original audience. The Epic of Gilgamesh, on the other hand, seems to describe a giant cube-shaped ark. The god Ea tells Utnapishtim, "The boat that you are going to build, her dimensions should all correspond. Her breadth and length should be the same." Like Atrahasis, the Gilgamesh epic specifies a reed vessel with multiple decks, a bunch of compartments, and a roof. And like Ziusudra in the Sumerian flood story, Utnapishtim creates a window to let the sunlight in after the rain stops. The story in Genesis also provides specific details about how to build the ark, but describes a rectangular ark. Like the other arks, it's coated with bitumen, and here the Hebrew text uses an Akkadian loanword that may have been inspired by Atrahasis or Gilgamesh. The Hebrew word used here, kofar, meaning bitumen, may derive from the Akkadian word kupru. The chapter describing Noah's Ark is odd for a few reasons. It says it's made from gopher wood, an unknown species, but probably not made out of gophers. It may also be a loanword from Akkadian and related to that word kofar. The Hebrew word translated as ark, teva, is also of unknown meaning and origin. It appears only one other time in the Hebrew Bible, describing the floating reed basket in which baby Moses is placed in the Book of Exodus. Dr. Finkel speculates that teva may be a Hebrewized word borrowed from Babylonian, tubu, which was a rectangular barge used for river crossings. So although the three versions of the ark differ from story to story, circular, cubic, and rectangular, there are some striking similarities. All three are nearly identical in their base area, despite being different shapes. Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and Genesis all give specific dimensions. The Ark of Atrahasis and Utnapishtim are both 14,400 cubits, while Noah's Ark rounds this up to 15,000 cubits. All three stories draw attention to bitumen being used to waterproof the Ark. All three stories draw attention to a window, multiple decks, and compartments. And all three describe the hero saving both domestic and wild animals aboard the Ark. In the Atrahasis epic, the god Enki sends the animals to Atrahasis so that they're waiting for him when he loads the boat. Remarkably, it states that the animals entered 2 by 2, a detail that is very familiar to us from Genesis. The Atrahasis epic says, "But the wild animals from the steppe, 2 by 2, they entered the Ark." Compare this to Genesis chapter 7, verses 8 and 9. "Of clean animals, and of animals that are not clean, and of birds, and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the Ark." As for the humans on board the Ark, the Atrahasis epic includes the hero, his wife, his family, and a number of skilled workers. The Gilgamesh epic, which seems to be more concerned with the preservation of civilization, specifies that people of every skill and craft are to be brought on board. In Genesis, only Noah and his immediate family have a place on the Ark. Everyone else is left out to dry, so to speak. The release of birds is one of the most compelling examples of the Bible's dependence on earlier flood traditions. In Gilgamesh, after the storm has subsided, Utnapishtim releases first a dove, and then a swallow, and finally a raven to search for dry land. When the raven doesn't return, Utnapishtim knows that he can safely leave the Ark. In the Ugaritic fragment, a dove and a crane are sent out. And in Genesis, Noah releases a raven, and when it doesn't come back, he releases a dove 3 different times. It's interesting that Noah's raven, like in Gilgamesh, doesn't return, though an interesting feature in the Genesis story is that the dove brings back an olive leaf, a plant native to the Levant but not Mesopotamia. So the flood story in Genesis clearly draws on these earlier narratives, and is most closely related to the story found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Scholars theorize that this cultural transmission may have occurred during the Babylonian exile. In 587 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire invaded the Kingdom of Judah and carried a bunch of its population back to Mesopotamia. Notably, it was the Judahite elite and educated that were most likely to be captured. Dr. Finkel theorizes that these Judahite scribes eventually learned cuneiform and became directly familiar with the Babylonian stories in their original Akkadian language. But these Judahite scribes were not passive recipients of the flood myth. These stories were reworked to fit a Judahite audience and to fit Judahite religion. So far we've focused on relatively surface-level similarities and differences. The Atrahasis arc is circular, Noah's ark is rectangular. Utnapishtim sends out a raven, swallow, and dove. Noah only sends out a raven and dove. Nothing earth-shattering here. But there's one way that Genesis differs significantly from the other versions, a difference that fundamentally changes the moral of the story and the morals of the story. In Genesis, a single deity, called Yahweh by J and Elohim by P, is responsible for both the decision to eradicate humans and the counter-decision to save them. This introduces a fascinating difference between Genesis and the other three versions with respect to divine justice. The three earlier versions feature multiple gods, and with multiple gods there are multiple divine characters who can play different roles, most notably the villainous god Enlil and the savior god Enki. This leaves room to criticize the gods, because some of them are misbehaving or acting capriciously. In the Atrahasis epic, Enlil decides to send a flood because humanity was too noisy, and he was losing sleep over it. You might think that this is wildly disproportionate overkill. Kill all humans because you're having trouble sleeping? Isn't that capricious and cruel? And you wouldn't be alone in thinking that, because the Atrahasis epic seems to agree with that sentiment. The gods by no means are portrayed in a positive light for sending the flood. The creator goddess Nintu weeps when she witnesses her people dying in the flood. She wept, she gave vent to her feelings, the gods wept with her for the country. The other gods are self-aware that they are witnessing a gross injustice. We also see this in the end of the Atrahasis epic when Atrahasis makes a sacrifice to the gods. There's a satirical scene when the gods swarm the sacrificial meat like a bunch of flies, presumably because they were so hungry from the lack of sacrifice. The gods sniffed the savor, they were gathered like flies around the offering. After they've consumed the food, the creator goddess stands up and condemns the other gods. They who irrationally brought about the flood and relegated the peoples to catastrophe. One version of the Atrahasis epic goes so far as to condemn Enlil for acting wickedly. The gods commanded an annihilation, a wicked thing that Enlil will do to the people. A similar scene is shared in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In Gilgamesh, the gods smell the aroma of Utnapishtim's sacrifice and are pleased by it, but the creator goddess stands up and explicitly condemns Enlil. But let not Enlil come to the offering, for he, unreasoning, brought on the deluge and my people consigned to destruction. The sacrifice prompts a discussion among the gods about the unfairness of the flood. Ea declares from now on the gods should punish individuals for their own sins, not collectively. The flood story in both Atrahasis and Gilgamesh is a theological critique of the gods. As one scholar puts it, a theological critique that the gods only jeopardize their own livelihood in destroying their human sources of support. The stories wrestle with concepts of senseless suffering, familiar topics for philosophers and theologians to this day. But these themes of theological critique and divine injustice are completely reworked in Genesis, because God is both the instigator of the flood and the savior from it. Since God can't be the villain, Genesis focuses on the wickedness of humanity and the righteousness of the main character, Noah. Humans are so evil that the God of Israel is justified to destroy them, and Noah is so righteous he is worthy to be saved. The scholar Christine Hayes suggests that the writers of Genesis are determined to depict God not as capricious, but as operating with clear standards of justice, making the flood a deserved punishment. Another important difference is the story's attitude toward the growth of humanity. In Gilgamesh and the other Mesopotamian stories, the gods see the proliferation of humans as a problem that needs to be solved. But Genesis commands humans to multiply and repopulate the world. According to the biblical scholar Thomas Romer, this emphasis is a direct response to the Babylonian myths. In Gilgamesh, the problem with the flood is that it was too extreme, but even Ea doesn't disagree that limiting the growth of humanity is a worthy goal. After the flood, Ea tells Enlil, instead of sending the flood, the lion should have risen to decimate the human mass. Instead of sending the flood, there could be a famine to afflict the country. Instead of sending the flood, Era, the plague god, should have risen to bruise the country. Ea is more angry about the disproportionate method of destruction, not necessarily the goal of limiting human population growth. Dr. Romer argues that by shifting the focus to the wickedness of humanity, Genesis actually attempts a more ethical rereading of the Babylonian story. Evil, and not population growth, is the cause of the wrath of God. Despite their many differences, the many versions of the Near Eastern flood myth contain universal themes that ancient people found compelling regardless of where they lived and what gods they worshipped. Divine justice versus divine capriciousness, righteousness versus evil, and these themes may help to explain the story's remarkable staying power as it was passed on generation after generation for hundreds of years. This video is sponsored by 80,000 Hours. They're a nonprofit that helps
What do you
people
think?
find...
Hello?
Yeah, on here.
Yeah.
I was just flipping.
So,
Welcome to Religion for Breakfast.
interesting, right?
Yeah.
Dedicated to the...
Yeah, I'm sure there's more flood stories than that, right?
But it gives you a little bit more insight, right? Like into the construction of the Bible itself.
I almost think there was like multiple Noahs. I don't know. Because why, like, unless no, well, no, hold on. Noah could have been like 100,000 years ago.
We're gonna watch some other stuff. 1 second. We're going deep down the hole. I'm setting broader context because we're gonna get into the esoteric. We're gonna get back to the occult stuff because I wanna show you guys what all the occult stuff is about.